3. The connective synthesis of production. Given the syntheses of the unconscious, the practical problem is that of their use, legitimate or not, and of the conditions that define a use of synthesis as legitimate or not. Take the example of homosexuality, though it is something more than an example. We noted how in Proust the famous passages of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities of the plain, interlace two openly contradictory themes: the fundamental guilt of the accursed races and the radical innocence of flowers. The diagnosis of Oedipal homosexuality with a mother fixation of a dominant depressive nature and a sadomasochistic guilt was quickly applied to Proust. In a more general way still, some critics were too quick in discovering contradictions, either in order to declare them irreducible or to resolve them, or to show that they were merely apparent according to preference. In truth, there are never contradictions, apparent or real, but only degrees of humor. And inasmuch as reading itself has its degrees of humor, from black to white, with which it evaluates the coexisting degrees of what it reads, the sole problem is always one of allocation on a scale of intensities that assigns the position and use of each thing, each being, or each scene. There is this and then that, and let's make do with it. Too bad if it doesn't suit us. In this regard, it is possible that Charlus' coarse admonition is prophetic. A lot we care about our old grandmother, you little shit. For what does in fact take place in Search of Lost Time, one and the same story with infinite variations? It is clear that the narrator sees nothing, hears nothing, and that he is a body without organs, or like a spider poised in its web, observing nothing, but responding to the slightest sign, to the slightest vibration by springing on its prey. Everything begins with nebulae, statistical wholes whose outlines are blurred, molar or collective formations comprising singularities distributed haphazardly, a living room, a group of girls, a landscape. Then, within these nebulae, or these collectives, sides take shape, series are arranged, persons figure in these series, under strange laws of lack, absence, asymmetry, exclusion, non-communication, vice, and guilt. Next, everything becomes blurred again, everything comes apart, but this time in a molecular and pure multiplicity, where the partial objects, the boxes, the vessels, all have their positive determinations, and enter into aberrant communication, following a transversal that runs through the whole work. An immense flow that each partial object produces and cuts again, reproduces and cuts at the same time. More than vice, says Proust, it is madness and its innocence that disturb us. If schizophrenia is the universal, the great artist is indeed the one who scales the schizophrenic wall and reaches the land of the unknown, where he no longer belongs to any time, any milieu, any school. Such is the case in an illustrative passage. The first kiss given Albertine. Albertine's face is at first a nebula, barely extracted from the collective of girls. Then her person disengages itself through a series of views that are like distinct personalities, with Albertine's face jumping from one plane to another as the narrator's lips draw near her cheek. At last, within the magnified proximity, everything falls apart like a face drawn in sand. Albertine's face shatters into molecular partial objects, while those on the narrator's face rejoin the body without organs, eyes closed, nostrils pinched shut, mouth filled. What is more, their entire love tells the same story. From the statistical nebula, from the molar entirety of men-women loves, there emerge the two accursed and guilty series that bear witness to the same castration with two non-superimposable sides, the Sodom series and the Gomorrah series, each one excluding the other. This is not all, however, since the vegetal theme, the innocence of flowers, brings us yet another message and another code. Everyone is bisexual, everyone has two sexes, but partitioned, non-communicating. The man is merely the one in whom the male part, and the woman the one in whom the female part dominates statistically. So that at the level of elementary combinations, At least two men and two women must be made to intervene to constitute the multiplicity in which transverse communications are established, connections of partial objects and flows. The male part of a man can communicate with the female part of a woman, but also with the male part of a woman, or with the female part of another man, or yet again with the male part of the other man, etc. Here all guilt ceases, for it cannot cling to such flowers as these. In contrast to the alternative of the either-or exclusions, there is the either-or of the combinations and permutations, where the differences amount to the same without ceasing to be differences. We are statistically or molally heterosexual, but personally homosexual without knowing it or being fully aware of it. And finally, we are transsexual in an elemental molecular sense. That is why Proust, the first to deny all Oedipalizing interpretations of his own interpretations, contrasts two kinds of homosexuality, or rather two regions, only one of which is Oedipal, exclusive and depressive, the other being anedipal, schizoid, included, and inclusive. For some, doubtless those whose childhoods were timid, the material kind of pleasure they take does not matter, so long as they can relate it to a male countenance, while others, whose sensuality is doubtless more violent, give their material pleasure certain imperious localizations. The second group would shock most people by their avowals. They live perhaps less exclusively under Saturn's satellite, for in their case women are not entirely excluded. But those in the second group seek out women who prefer women, women who suggest young men. Indeed, they can take with such women the same pleasure as with a man, for in their relations with women they play, for the woman who prefers women, the role of another woman, and at the same time a woman offers them approximately what they find in a man. The opposition here is between two uses of the connective syntheses, a global and specific use, and a partial and non-specific use. In the first, desire at the same time receives a fixed subject, an ego specified according to a given sex, and complete objects defined as global persons. The complexity and the foundations of such an operation appear more distinctly if we consider the mutual reactions between the different syntheses of the unconscious following a given use. It is first of all the synthesis of recording that in effect situates, on its surface of inscription within the conditions of Oedipus, a definable and differentiable ego in relation to parental images serving as coordinates, mother-father. There we have a triangulation that implies in its essence a constituent prohibition, and that conditions the differentiation between persons. Prohibition of incest with the mother, prohibition against taking the father's place. But a strange sort of reasoning leads one to conclude that, since it is forbidden, that very thing was desired. In reality, global persons, even the very form of persons, do not exist prior to the prohibitions that weigh on them and constitute them, any more than they exist prior to the triangulation into which they enter. Desire receives its first complete objects and is forbidden them at one and the same time. Therefore, it is indeed the same Oedipal operation that lays the foundations for the possibility of its own resolution, by way of a differentiation of persons in conformity with the prohibition, as well as the possibility for its own failure or stagnation, by falling into the undifferentiated as the reverse side of the differentiation created by the prohibitions, incest by identification with the father, homosexuality by identification with the mother. The personal material of transgression does not exist prior to the prohibition, any more than does the form of persons. We can therefore see the property the prohibition has of displacing itself, since from the start it displaces desire. It displaces itself in the sense that the Oedipal inscription does not force its way into the synthesis of recording without reacting on the synthesis of production, and profoundly changing the connections of this synthesis by introducing new global persons. These new images of persons are the sister and the spouse, after the father and the mother. It has often been remarked, in fact, that the prohibition existed in two forms, the one negative, having to do above all with the mother and imposing differentiation, the other positive, concerning the sister and requiring exchange. I have a moral obligation to take as wife someone other than my sister, and an obligation to keep my sister for someone else. I must give up my sister to a brother-in-law, receive my wife from a father-in-law. And although new stases or relapses are produced at this level, such as new forms of incest and homosexuality, it is certain that the Oedipal triangle would have no way of transmitting and reproducing itself without this second step. The first step elaborates the form of the triangle, but it is only the second step that ensures the transmission of this figure. I take a woman other than my sister in order to constitute the differentiated base of a new triangle whose inverted vertex will be my child, which is called surmounting Oedipus, but reproducing it as well, transmitting it rather than dying all alone, incestuous, homosexual, and a zombie. Thus, the parental or familial use of the synthesis of recording extends into a conjugal use, or an alliance use, of the connective syntheses of production. A regime for the pairing of people replaces the connection of partial objects. On the whole, the connections of organ machines suited to desiring production give way to a pairing of people under the rules of familial reproduction. Partial objects now seem to be taken from people rather than from the non-personal flows that pass from one person to another. The reason is that persons are derived from abstract quantities instead of from flows. Instead of a connective appropriation, partial objects become the possessions of a person and, when required, the property of another person. Just as he draws upon centuries of scholastic reflection in defining God as the principle of the disjunctive syllogism, Kant draws upon centuries of Roman juridical reflection when he defines marriage as the tie that makes a person the owner of the sexual organs of another person. One need only consult a religious manual of sexual casuistry to see what restrictions the organ-desiring machine connections remain tolerated within the regime for the pairing of people, which legally determines what may be appropriated from the body of the wife. Clearer still, the difference in regime becomes apparent each time a society permits an infantile stage of sexual promiscuity to subsist, where everything is permitted until the age when the young man, in turn, submits to the principle of pairing that regulates the social production of children. It is true that the connections of desiring production were found to comply with the binary rule, and we have even seen that a third term intervened in this binarity, the body without organs that re-injects producing into the product, extends the connections of machines, and serves as a surface of recording. But here no bi-univocal process is in fact produced that would fit production into the mold of representatives. No triangulation appears at this level that would refer the objects of desire to global persons, or desire to a specific subject. The only subject is desire itself on the body without organs, inasmuch as it machines partial objects and flows, selecting and cutting the one with the other, passing from one body to another, following connections and appropriations that each time destroy the factitious unity of a possessive or proprietary ego. An-Oedipal sexuality. The triangle takes form in the parental use and reproduces itself in the conjugal use. We do not yet know what forces bring about this triangulation that interferes with the recording of desire in order to transform all its productive connections. But we are able at least to follow, abstractly, the manner in which these forces proceed. We are told that partial objects are caught up in an intuition of precocious totality, just as the ego is caught up in an intuition of unity that precedes its fulfillment. Even in Melanie Klein, the schizoid partial object is related to a whole that prepares for the advent of the complete objects in the depressive phase. It is clear that such a totality unity is posited only in terms of a certain mode of absence, as that which partial objects and subjects of desire lack. Consequently, everything is played out from the start. Everywhere we encounter the analytic process that consists in extrapolating a transcendent and common something, but that is a common universal for the sole purpose of introducing lack into desire, in situating and specifying persons, and an ego under one aspect or another of its absence, and imposing an exclusive direction on the disjunction of the sexes. Such is the case in Freud. For Oedipus, for castration, for the second phase of the fantasy, a child is being beaten, or again for the famous latency period where the analytical mystification culminates. This common, transcendent, absent something will be called phallus or law. in order to designate the signifier that distributes the effects of meaning throughout the chain and introduces exclusions there, whence the Oedipalizing interpretations of Lacanism. This signifier acts as the formal cause of the triangulation, that is to say, makes possible both the form of the triangle and its reproduction. Oedipus has as its formula 3 plus 1, the one of the transcendent phallus, without which the terms considered would not take the form of a triangle. It is as if the so-called signifying chain, made up of elements that are themselves non-signifying, of polyvocal writing and detachable fragments, were the object of a special treatment, a crushing operation that extracted a detached object from the chain, a despotic signifier from whose law the entire chain seems consequently to be suspended, each link triangulated. There we have a curious paralogism, implying a transcendent use of the syntheses of the unconscious. We pass from detachable partial objects to the detached complete object, from which global persons derive by an assigning of lack. For example, in the capitalist code and its trinitary expression, money as detachable chain is converted into capital as detached object, which exists only in the fetishist view of stocks and lacks. The same is true of the Oedipal code. The libido as energy of selection and detachment is converted into the phallus as detached object, the latter existing only in the transcendent form of stock and lack, something common and absent that is just as lacking in men as in women. It is this conversion that makes the whole of sexuality shift into the Oedipal framework, this projection of all the breaks flows onto the same mythical locale, and all the non-signifying signs into the same major signifier. The effective triangulation makes it possible to assign sexuality to one of the sexes. The partial objects have lost nothing of their virulence and efficacy, yet the reference to the penis gives its full meaning to castration. Through it, all the external experiences linked to deprivation, to frustration, to the lack of partial objects take on meaning after the fact. All previous history is recast in a new version in the light of castration. That is indeed what disturbs us, this recasting of history and this lack attributed to partial objects. And how could partial objects not have lost their virulence and efficacy once they had been introduced into a use of synthesis that remains fundamentally illegitimate with regard to them? We do not deny that there is an Oedipal sexuality, an Oedipal heterosexuality and homosexuality, an Oedipal castration, as well as complete objects, global images, and specific egos. We deny that these are productions of the unconscious. What is more, castration and Oedipalization beget a basic illusion that makes us believe that real desiring production is answerable to higher formations that integrate it, subject it to transcendent laws, and make it serve a higher social and cultural production. There then appears a kind of unsticking of the social field with regard to the production of desire, in whose name all resignations are justified in advance. Psychoanalysis, at the most concrete level of therapy, reinforces this apparent movement with its combined forces. Psychoanalysis itself ensures this conversion of the unconscious. In what it calls the pre-Oedipal, it sees a stage that must be surmounted in the direction of an evolutive integration toward the depressive position under the reign of the complete object, or organized in the direction of a structural integration toward the position of a despotic signifier under the reign of the phallus. The aptitude for conflict of which Freud spoke, the qualitative opposition between homosexuality and heterosexuality, is in fact a consequence of Oedipus. Far from being an obstacle to treatment encountered from without, it is a product of Oedipalization, and a counter-effect of the treatment that reinforces it. In reality, the problem has nothing to do with pre-Oedipal stages that would still revolve around an Oedipal axis, but rather with the existence and the nature of an Oedipal sexuality, an Oedipal heterosexuality and homosexuality, and Oedipal castration. The breaks flows of desiring production do not let themselves be projected onto a mythical locale. The signs of desire do not let themselves be extrapolated from a signifier. Transsexuality does not let any qualitative opposition between a local and non-specific heterosexuality and a local and non-specific homosexuality arise. Everywhere, in this reversion, the innocence of flowers instead of the guilt of conversion. But rather than ensuring or tending to ensure the reversion of the entire unconscious according to the Anedipal form and within the Anedipal content of desiring production, analytic theory and practice never cease to promote the conversion of the unconscious to Oedipus, form and content. We shall see, in effect, what psychoanalysis calls resolving Oedipus. This conversion is therefore promoted by psychoanalysis, first of all, by making a global and specific use of the connective syntheses. This use can be defined as transcendent and implies a first paralogism in the psychoanalytic process. For a simple reason, we again make use of Kantian terminology. In what he termed the critical revolution, Kant intended to discover criteria immanent to understanding so as to distinguish the legitimate and the illegitimate uses of the syntheses of consciousness. In the name of transcendental philosophy, immanence of criteria, he therefore denounced the transcendent use of syntheses such as appeared in metaphysics. In like fashion, we are compelled to say that psychoanalysis has its metaphysics. Its name is Oedipus. And that a revolution, this time materialist, can proceed only by way of a critique of Oedipus, by denouncing the illegitimate use of the syntheses of the unconscious as found in Oedipal psychoanalysis, so as to rediscover a transcendental unconscious defined by the immanence of its criteria, and a corresponding practice that we shall call schizoanalysis.